Okay, it's chapter 24. I've removed the nervous system and put it on another, it'll be on another lecture. So these different systems have to do with distributing needed substances and removing waste from the body. And it includes the circulatory system, which includes moves oxygen from the lungs to the heart, which then pumps the oxygen-rich blood to the rest of the body, and then takes carbon dioxide, and that is then sent to the lungs where it's exhaled out. And then there's the respiratory system, brings oxygen in and expels our carbon dioxide out to support cellular respiration. The urinary system removes excess fluid, water-soluble toxins, damaged compounds, waste products. And then there's the digestive system, in which we get our nutrients, and those are then brought into the bloodstream and then distributed to the cells. So these systems are interconnected. Carbon dioxide collected by the circulatory system is delivered to the respiratory system, exchanged for gas exchange outside the environment. Circulatory system brings substances dissolved in the blood to the urinary system, and so on. So the blood is composed of a bunch of different kinds of cells and cell fragments and other constituents that float in the fluid, which is blood plasma. And those blood cells include red blood cells for carrying oxygen, white blood cells that are involved in the immune system, and then a bunch of other things like platelets, clotting factors, all kinds of different things. And the plasma is the fluid portion, right? So low capacity for transporting dissolved oxygen, but it does carry dissolved carbon dioxide out. And then blood cells float in the plasma and carry the oxygen in hemoglobin. Okay. So blood consists of fluid and several different types of cells. Blood plasma is 92% water and contains all kinds of dissolved gases, ions, molecules that are all critical for homeostasis, nutrients, signaling molecules, that's our hormones. Carbon dioxide is carried from the blood in the plasma and then transported to the lungs and where it's exhaled. So in the blood there are clotting factors, and there are also platelets which are involved in clotting. So there's small cell fragments, they clump together to help stop the loss of blood if a blood vessel is damaged or there's a wound. Platelets release substances that stimulate plasma proteins to create a meshwork of protein strands, platelets, and blood cells to adequately form a blood clot. And then there's a bunch of chemicals that are called clotting factors. Red blood cells, of course, carry all of the oxygen in the hemoglobin. They're the only cells in the body that don't have a nucleus. A mature red blood cell has no nucleus, and its cytoplasm is packed with oxygen-binding proteins called hemoglobin. Each hemoglobin molecule can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules. Because each human blood cell contains about 280 million hemoglobin molecules, a single one of these cells can bind over 1 billion molecules of oxygen. A very efficient transport system. There are different kinds of blood, red blood cells. There's also fetal hemoglobin with fetal red blood cells. That's even more binding to oxygen. And then there's a whole bunch of immune cells. We call them white blood cells or lymphocytes. There's all kinds. There's macrophages, neutrophils, B cells, lymphocytes, and all that, and we'll get into that. So the majority of carbon dioxide that is released from cells during cellular respiration, they take in oxygen, they break down glucose, they produce ATP, and they release carbon dioxide. That goes into the blood plasma and is carried eventually to the lungs where it's exhaled out. Okay, blood vessels. Okay, so obviously there's blood vessels that actually carry the blood, including the plasma and all the different cells. They're a critical part of the cardiovascular system. It's a closed circulatory system consisting of a muscular heart, a complex network of blood vessels that collectively form a closed loop in the blood that circulates through the heart and blood vessels. Not all animals actually have a closed cardiovascular system. There are three kinds of blood vessels. There's large muscular vessels. These are arteries. These move oxygenated blood away from the heart. They're under pressure, and that's why they are muscular. The veins are large non-muscular vessels, and they return the blood that's depleted of oxygen back to the heart, where it will then be shunted to the lungs to pick up more oxygen. There's different size arteries. The biggest artery is the aorta. All these different size veins, and then at the point where blood, which is carrying oxygen and nutrients and all that, is then distributed to the cells. These are very, very, very small vessels, blood vessels, and they're called capillaries, where materials are exchanges between the cells, and especially they form what are called capillary beds, which we'll get to. So, arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arterioles and venules are smaller arteries and veins, respectively. So, veins are not as muscular as arteries because they don't have to sustain pressure as large as those in most arteries. Veins can have an added feature that arteries do not have. They have valves to keep the blood flowing towards the heart, especially the veins in the legs. You don't want blood pooling in the legs. So when it's pumped, the blood doesn't drain back down. So here we see capillaries are extremely thin, porous walls across which materials diffuse easily, whether it's oxygen or ions or nutrients, all those different kinds of things. It's called a capillary bed. Arteries and veins have large diameters and elastic walls to rapidly transport large volumes of blood. Blood flow is different to different parts of the body, can be altered during the rest or exercise. And also, blood carries heat. And so, in terms of if it's cold outside, the blood vessels constrict to hold the heat in. Or if the body is offloading heat, especially the vessels near the skin, are expand and heat is released. So if you go to chapter 24 and view the animation on circulation and respiration, and we'll go over that. Okay, so the human heart is a muscular organ the size of the fist, of course, work as the body's circulatory pump. It's divided into 4 chambers, form 2 distinct pumping units, and are independent but coordinated. So the pumping has to be very coordinated. There are two circuits that are tied together. The systemic circuit, the two chambers on the left pump blood through the entire body, and the pulmonary circuit, the two chambers on the right pump blood to the lungs, get rid of CO2 and pick up O2, and then back to the heart to be pumped out through the systemic system. Heart pumps all the time, doesn't stop unless there's a real problem. And it goes on from the day before you're born, when the heart is actually forming, to through when you're a fetus, to when you're born until you die. It pumps a lot of 7,000 liters of blood a day, about 1,850 gallons, just on and on and on. The number of times a heart beats per minute is the heart rate. Resting average heart rate is 60 to 100 beats per minute. Anything usually over 90 is called tachycardia. Athletes and people in really good shape tend to have lower heart rates and lower blood pressure. So blood pressure is the force in which the heart pushes blood through the arteries. When the heart contracts to push blood out, blood pressure is at its highest, and that's called a systole. Then when the heart relaxes, these are different chambers, we'll look at them. As heart relaxes after each contraction, blood pressure is at its lowest. That's why when you get blood pressure measured, you have a high number and a low number. So normally, average blood pressure is 120 over 80, but it varies a lot. And like I said, for athletes in really good shape, a lot of them can have blood pressure as low as 100 over 60, and they're fine. Anything over, let's say 140 over 90 is high blood pressure, and actually the doctors are now trying to keep everybody's blood pressure below 120 over 80. Okay. So the human heart is divided into 4 chambers. The upper chambers are called atria. Each is an atrium. The lower chambers are called ventricles. One-way valves separate the atria from the ventricles. In other words, atria take in blood. They receive either, if it's coming from the rest of the body, they receive blood from the rest of the body that's deoxygenated. And then that's the left atrium. And then there's also the right atrium, which, so the left ventricle pumps to the rest of the body. That's part of the systemic. The right ventricle pumps to the lungs. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs and then pumps it into the left ventricle. And then the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood, which then goes to the right ventricle, which is then pumped to the lungs. Okay, now we'll go over that more in a second. The thing is, all these different chambers have to pump at the right time. And so there's kind of an electrical system that uses ions to coordinate the system. So the pacemaker or SA node, is part of this electrical system, along with the AV node, and these have to be synced up. Sometimes people have problems with their electrical system in the heart, either after a heart attack or for some other reason. And then oftentimes they need what's called a pacemaker, which paces, depending on which chamber needs pacing, paces those different chambers. Normally what they try to do is not have a system where the ventricle, like the left ventricle, needs pacing. That's really a bad situation when that happens. Okay? So the SA and AV nodes generate cardiac contractions automatically without the need for input from the nervous system. In other words, doesn't need nerve signals at all. Okay? So let's take a look. The left ventricle is larger than the right ventricle. Its muscular walls are 3 times as thick. This is because the left ventricle must generate high pressures to distribute blood across the long and complex network of the systemic circuit to the whole rest of the body versus to the lungs. In contrast, the right ventricle pumps blood to the nearby lung and the relatively simple system of blood vessels that make up the pulmonary circuit. So let's first take a look at the right chambers serve the pulmonary circuit in blue. Coming from the rest of the body, the blood is no longer as deoxygenated and is now carrying carbon dioxide in the blood plasma. So the right chamber comes into the right atrium, oxygen poor blood. And here's the right atrium. It's then pumped into the right ventricle. The blood is then pumped to the lungs, and the alveoli, and where the carbon dioxide is exchanged, and then where oxygen is taken in and carried by the hemoglobin. So now we have oxygen-rich blood that goes to the left atrium, and then it's pumped in through these one-way valves into the left ventricle, and then it is pumped through the rest of the body and into the capillary beds, where it actually, the exchange of oxygen and nutrients and all that kind of stuff. So these are very, very small blood vessels, very thin walls, and gas exchange is happening here. So oxygen is offloaded to the cells. The cells release carbon dioxide from cellular respiration, and it's carried back to the heart. So, in terms of the flow of blood, you have to know this. The beginning with the left atrium lists the locations of a drop of blood as it moves through the circulatory system. Left atrium, left ventricle, arteries, capillaries, veins, right atrium, right ventricle, lungs, left atrium. Okay. Respiratory system. This is the lungs. Carries air, which contains oxygen, from the nose or mouth to the lungs through a series of tubular passageways that get smaller and smaller and smaller. The lungs are the main organs that allow air to move between the external environment and the inside of the body, and they also provide the gas exchange surfaces of these gases to go into the bloodstream, either oxygen in to the blood with the hemoglobin, or taking carbon dioxide out. Inhaling, the process of taking air into the lungs. The air is about 21% oxygen, a little carbon dioxide and water vapor. Exhaling, the process of expelling air from the lungs. The air has less oxygen, about 15%, and about 4% each for carbon dioxide and water vapor. These gases are exchanged at the surface of the cells in our lungs. So the oxygen is removed from the inhaled air through what are called the alveoli and into the bloodstream where they're taken up by hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide from the blood crosses into the alveoli and then are expelled, removed from the bloodstream, and added to the air and exhaled. Okay. Most of the time, breathing is controlled automatically by central systems located in the heart and brain. Now, we can also control our breathing with a system of muscles, and the main muscles are the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is one of the thickest muscles, and it forms the chest cavity for contracting the lungs. Lung volume increases as the rib cage is pulled out and the diaphragm moves down. As a result, the pressure in the lungs drops below atmospheric pressure, since the gases will move from a region of higher pressure to a region of lower pressure. Outside air rushes in, and the lungs fill with oxygen-rich air. So it's kind of creating a vacuum at first that pulls in air from the outside. Okay, exhalation. Lung volume decreases as the rib cage is pulled in and the diaphragm moves up, pushing the air out of the lungs. This action compresses the space in the chest cavity, raising the pressure inside the lung and forcing the air out. When is the air richer in oxygen? As it enters the body or exits as it enters, obviously. So there's two parts to the respiratory system. The upper respiratory system includes airways in the nose, mouth, and throat. As the air enters the throat, or the pharynx, this is the area where the back of the mouth and the two naval cavities join together in a single passageway. The air moves into the larynx, or the voice box, the entryway to the windpipe, or the trachea. Then it enters the lower respiratory system, including the trachea, the bronchi, and the lungs. So, upper, nose, mouth, throat, pharynx, larynx, trachea, lower respiratory. The trachea goes into the bronchi, and then the lungs, and then the trachea branches into two smaller tubes of bronchi, singular bronchus. They're paired lungs, and then the smallest parts are the alveoli. Okay, so again, the upper respiratory system, nose, mouth, pharynx, larynx, the voice box, requires air to pass through it to make sounds. That's the upper respiratory system. Right here. Lower respiratory system includes the trachea, lungs, the bronchus, and at the very smallest level, the alveoli. Okay. Here we are. So here's the bronchi, bronchus for each one. Okay. They're wider tubes. You should know how the air and oxygen move through the pulmonary system. So the bronchi divide into bronchioles, which are smaller, series of branching ever smaller tubes The tiniest bronchioles open into alveoli, singular alveolus, which are small clusters of sacs resemble a bunch of grapes, and gases are exchanged across the moist surface of the thin layers of cells that line each alveolar sac to the capillaries, which then exchange oxygen. So let's take a look. So air is coming in from the upper system. The human trachea, which carries air into the lungs, divides into progressively finer and finer and finer tubes called the bronchioles. The oxygen-poor blood is pumped out from the heart to the lungs. The oxygen-rich blood is pumped from the lungs to the heart. Okay. More than 150 million tiny alveoli in each human lung create a large surface area for gas exchange. So this is how nutrients and gas and everything else exchanges. You go from very, very small tubes, which a large surface area, versus very large tubes, which is smaller surface area. Okay, so you can see the bronchiole carrying oxygen poor blood into the alveoli where gas is exchanged. Oxygen enters and carbon dioxide leaves through the alveoli. The specialized cells in the alveolar walls are extremely thin, so the gases need to diffuse only a very short distance. So this is all diffusion in terms of high concentration versus low concentration. Okay? And there's opening into the neighboring alveolus, and these are all small capillaries, like right here, where the gases are exchanged into. Okay. So why is a large surface area important for gas exchange? Gases are exchanged through diffusion. And the rate of diffusion is directly related to the surface area available. And one way to create larger surface areas is to have many, many small branching tubes. So when a person has pneumonia, the alveoli may fill with fluids, which would be this. Why would this be a problem? Gas exchange. So this is the problem really with COVID-19 and with any sort of pneumonia, where the alveoli become stiff. They fill up with various liquids or with like white blood cells, inflammation, and they can't exchange gases. And so you get into a situation of respiratory distress. Acute respiratory distress, that's when you have to be put on a ventilator. Okay. So, the urinary system. Okay, the urinary system gets rid of waste products, mainly nitrogen compounds that go into the urine, and then also toxins that might be taken out of the blood. The urinary system is like the lungs, the pulmonary system. It goes from large vessels into smaller and smaller vessels with capillary beds where nutrients or ions or things like that are exchanged. So the paired kidneys are the main organs of the urinary system. The kidneys also maintain water and solute homeostasis in 3 ways. Okay? The intestine also can control water by pumping it back in into the blood. So first of all, blood coming into the kidneys, or the kidneys filter and regulate the composition of blood. They cleanse the blood of metabolic wastes. the main unit that does this is called the nephron. This is the kidney's basic functional units. It then, as it gets into smaller and smaller spaces and greater surface area, it then interfaces with capillary beds, where water and solutes are exchanged. So it also reabsorbs water. You don't want to lose lots of water through the kidneys. Some animals have incredibly efficient systems for not losing water, like kangaroo rats found in deserts. Reabsorption of the water and solutes in normal blood amounts of blood. So you don't want to lose water too much. Obviously, the urine is full of water, but it's concentrated mainly with nitrogen compounds. And then secretion actively transports excess quantities of solutes, such as potassium and hydrogen ions and some medications and toxins from the blood into the urine. The waste-carrying solution is expelled from the body. The ureter's tubes that deliver urine to the bladder for storage, and the urethra that delivers urine from the bladders and carries the urine out of the body. So, if you could look at the urinary system video as well. Okay. Position of nephrons in the kidney. So, you've got blood coming in without waste, that's being sent out, and blood in waste coming into the kidney. So, into the kidney, and then out the kidney. Okay? The kidney, here's the kidney, and they have all these compartments that are the nephrons. Okay? These are the nephrons. The urine, of course, is then pumped out. So here's a nephron, which has what are called loops of Henle. The blood comes in, waste is taken out, and then sent into the urine, where it's then peed out. This is the basic unit of the kidneys. Each kidney has about 1 million nephrons. Each nephron has 5 different sections. The glomeralis Bowman's capsule at the very beginning, the proximate tubule, the loop of Henle. These kangaroo rats have much more finely divided and longer loops of Henle. Then the distal tubule and the collecting duct where the urine comes out of it. Okay. So, the glomeralis is a ball-shaped cluster of capillaries. The renal tubule contains the plasma that is filtered from the glomeralis. So plasma under pressure filters through the glomeralis into the tubule. This is blood coming in. They go into the capillaries. Water and valuable solutes like sodium, sugars, and small proteins are reabsorbed into the capillaries. You don't want to lose those. The rest of the waste products are secreted from the capillaries into the tubule. Actually, that's urine. And then the removal of water leads to urine 4 times as concentrated as in the blood. Okay. Without the kidneys, you've got real problems in terms of water, homeostasis, and toxins building up in the blood, and things like that. The renal tubule contains the plasma. Okay, the collecting duct removes the remaining filtrate urine as it leaves the collecting duct to the ureter and then to the bladder for storage, where it's then pumped out. So urine is released from the kidneys and it enters the bladder and then is excreted from the body. What's the difference between reabsorption and secretion? Reabsorption is the process of bringing substances back into the body, like excess water and glucose and all kinds of different things. And secretion is the movement of substances from the body into the urine. Okay, and then finally, we're going to get to the digestive system. So, we've talked about this already. Types of nutrients. There are micronutrients like vitamins and minerals. For example, potassium, sodium, calcium, vitamin C, vitamin D. These are kind of cofactors and coenzymes. And then large macronutrients, molecules that a lot of them carry energy, like carbohydrates and lipids, and also other large molecules, especially are like proteins. Lipids, of course, are our fats. So carbohydrates and lipids serve sources of energy. Carbohydrates are broken down. Well, first they can be stored as glycogen in the liver and muscles. They can then be broken down for cellular respiration. Lipids can also, through a more complex process, can be broken down. And then lipids are also used for cell membranes and things like that. And then remember, proteins do everything else. They do all the work. They are signaling proteins, enzymes that catalyze reactions. They carry other substances around, like hemoglobin is a protein that carries oxygen. Proteins serve as chemical building, they all serve as chemical building blocks. Sugars, fatty acids, and amino acids. So sugars are carbohydrates, simple sugars. Fatty acids are lipids. They're used in all kinds of different things. And they can be used as energy storage, and then amino acids are what make up proteins. Humans can synthesize 11 of the 20 amino acids. The amino acids, 9 of them, can only be we can only get them from food that we eat. We cannot manufacture them. So those are called essential amino acids. Okay? So these are the ones that we have to get from our diet. Minerals, and as we'll see, minerals and vitamins are also essential. They have to come from our diet, except for vitamin D. Okay? Sugars and fatty acids come from our diet, though we can manufacture different kinds of fatty acids. Okay. So, vitamins, small organic micronutrients. There are 2 kinds of vitamins. Water-soluble vitamins, they can't be stored. You can't overdose on them. If you take more than you need, they're excreted out of the kidneys. Examples are vitamin C and vitamin B vitamins, okay? There are also fat-soluble vitamins. They can be stored, and in large amounts, they can be toxins. So you can overdose on certain vitamins like vitamin D, A, E, and K. The only way we get a lot of vitamins are coenzymes or cofactors that are used in chemical reactions with enzymes, which are proteins of different kinds. So, vitamins needed by humans. Vitamin C is abundant in fruits and vegetables. A deficiency in vitamin C is called scurvy, leads to teeth and bones degenerate, connective tissue problems, toxin buildup, can have effects on cognition and pathological neurology. Fish is the richest source of vitamin D, but we actually make that ourselves if we're out in the sun. Fortified foods, that's milk, soy. A deficiency in vitamin D leads to poor formation of bones and teeth. Folic acid is a B vitamin. It's abundant in green vegetables. B12 and other vitamin D is scarce in plant foods, but abundant in milk, fish, and poultry. All these things we get from our foods. It is important for the maintenance of teeth, bones, and other tissues, and except for vitamin D, we actually make a lot of that ourselves. Vitamin E is abundant in nuts, vegetables, oils. It protects lipids in the cells, membranes, and so on. Let's see, vitamin D, I think it's called rickets if you don't have enough. Vitamin K, leafy green vegetables and some fruits, manufactured by intestinal bacteria. Deficiency can cause prolonged bleeding and slow wound healing. And carotene is responsible for color in a lot of fruits. And vitamin A, and which is used as visual pigments for all kinds of different things, for eyesight and so on. So, which are important for bones, which vitamins are more likely to accumulate. Fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. Are there any vitamins that you may not be eating enough of? Vitamin A, well, anyway, for the most part, in the United States, we have even eating junk food, we get enough vitamins. So I just want to say the whole vitamin supplement industry is bogus. We actually, in industrialized countries, the food supply is good enough that we get most of our vitamins that we need from our diet. If you're starving to death, obviously, those are the people that actually need vitamin supplements. So, minerals are also macronutrients. There are more than 20 needed for human health. Calcium is most abundant stored in the bones. Vitamin D is needed to absorb calcium from food as well as bone health. Low levels of vitamin D result in bone disorders and a wide range of diseases. But are the low levels a cause or the effect of the disease? Okay. So, digestive system absorbs vitamins, processes foods and nutrients, and eliminates waste. And there's different parts of the digestive system, starting with the mouth and saliva. The first stage in the processing of food into the mouth, the chemical breakdown of food. The oral cavity, the saliva contains enzymes that break apart carbohydrates and other things. The pharynx, that leads the common area leading to the trachea, which is the airway, and then the esophagus is where food for the digestive system goes. And then there's something called the epiglottis that keeps the trachea and the esophagus separate. So this is part of the swallowing reflex. And a lot of people with neurological problems have swallowing problems. And then digestive system 1, where some digestion begins in the stomach. Hydrochloric acid, high concentrations there. Most of the digestion, after it leaves from the stomach, goes into the small intestine, where most of the digestion and absorption occurs of nutrients, such as carbohydrates. Okay? And the small intestine goes from larger to smaller and smaller and smaller villi that then are tied into capillary beds for exchanging nutrients. So again, we go from large tubes and things like that to smaller and smaller with a larger surface area to transport stuff into the bloodstream, the nutrients including amino acids, carbohydrates, fats, minerals, vitamins, all that kind of stuff. The large intestine, then from the small intestine and the large intestine, you reabsorb water and minerals. The host bacteria that we have in our gut actually produces some vitamins that we need. Absorption, the uptake of mineral ions, including calcium and small molecule cells lining the cavity of the digestive tract. The anus is the muscle-lined opening at the end of the colon, the rectum, elimination of bodily waste, feces. And then there's a bunch of things tied into the digestive system, like the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder, and other things. So the pancreas, one of the main functions is producing insulin used in the absorption of glucose into cells. But the pancreas also produces a whole bunch of digestive enzymes that are released into different parts of the digestive system to break nutrients down. The liver produces bile, and bile is used in fluid and aiding in fat digestion. And gallbladder stores and dispenses bile to the small intestine. The digestive system converts food into absorbable nutrients. As the food moves through the digestive system, it's broken down into smaller molecules that can be absorbed by the lining of the intestine. So, as it goes through the intestine, you go from larger to smaller tubes, especially in the small intestine. So, the mouth and oral cavities, the salivary glands, they secrete saliva, which have enzymes which start digestion of starches. The esophagus goes from into the throat and into the esophagus. The liver makes bile, which helps digest fats. Here's the liver right here. 2 lobes, actually. Here's the stomach right here. Okay. I think this is the pancreas right here. The small intestine. Okay. The large intestine. Then goes to the anus. Okay. So, the liver makes bile, which digests fats. The stomach produces acid and protein digesting enzymes. The pancreas secretes digestive enzymes that are then fed into the small intestine. The gallbladder stores and releases bile. The small intestine, secretes digestive enzymes, and this is where most of the nutrients are absorbed. The large intestine absorbs water and minerals and helpful in bacteria that live in the intestine for producing vitamins and certain undigested food. Okay? And then it's expelled out through the anus, all the waste products. So, absorption in the small intestine. The lower region of the small intestine is specialized, again, with a large surface area for absorption to uptake of minerals, certain vitamins, and small molecules, including vitamin D and K, broken down in sugars, fatty acids, amino connected, and the smaller areas with large surface area are called the villi, finger-like projections in the small intestine that absorb nutrients. Each villus is about 1 millimeter long, with a surface consisting of cells specialized for nutrient absorption. So you have all these villi, like you have alveoli in the lungs, like you have loops of Henle in the nephrons and the kidneys, things like that. And we'll see what that looks like. So, the plasma membrane of each cell of the villi has many tiny projections. So the villi are actually made up of even things smaller called the microvilli. And they have complex foldings of the intestinal lining, kind of like okay, so here's the small intestine, the cavity where food and nutrients are coming in. The villi, each of these things are villi, and then they also are made of microvilli. These are here, and epithelial cells. So villi, okay, so extensive folding of the lining of the small intestine creates a large surface area over which absorption can happen. Blood vessels with each villus take up the nutrients absorbed through the epithelial cells. Okay, so the microvilli take in the nutrients and then put into the epithelial cells, which are then tied into capillaries. Very fine. So the complex folding, so we have these microvilli. This complex folding of the intestinal lining produces almost 300 square meters of surface area for absorption. Kind of just like with oxygen and the alveoli in the lungs, smaller and smaller and smaller, all jammed into a tighter space, but much more surface area for exchange. Why is a larger surface area important? With a larger surface area, a higher proportion of nutrients traveling through the small intestine will be absorbed into the body, since they are more likely to come into contact with the cells lining the small intestine. So the microvilli, because they're packed in and into smaller and smaller spaces, they increase absorption. Okay. Few foods actually contain vitamin D, but we can make some of it by being out in the sun. Fatty fish, this is salmon and tuna, cheese and egg yolks, calcium and dairy, can also be absorbed from the gut or the skin, transported to the liver, then the kidneys, so on. Okay. Vitamin D is the only vitamin that we can have manufactured entirely within our tissues from sunlight. So UV rays in the sunshine produce our skin cells, prompt the skin cells to convert a cholesterol-like molecule to vitamin D, which is then further modified in the liver and kidneys before becoming biologically as active. This is one thing, one vitamin that especially older Americans or older people have trouble, and a lot of times they don't have adequate amount of vitamin D, and so they actually do need to take supplements. Okay.